Thank you, that was great. But let me now introduce Nicholas Fink Haysom. Fink is a lawyer, and he was an associate professor of law at Wits University until 1994, when he was appointed legal advisor to President Mandela. He served as a chief legal advisor throughout Mandela's presidency, and he also acted as a mediator in labor and community conflicts in South Africa. He was closely involved in the negotiations leading up to the creation of the constitution. After leaving the office of the president upon Mandela's retirement, Fink has been involved in the Burundi peace talks as the chairman of the committee negotiating constitutional issues. He's advised on constitutional reform, electoral reform, conflict resolution, federalism and democracy strengthening in several African, Asian and Middle Eastern countries since 1998. He was the chief resource person at the IGAD Sudan peace talks and assisted with the negotiations until the signing of the CPA. From 2005 to 2006, he served as the head of the Office of Constitutional Support in the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq, and in 2007 was appointed by the UN Secretary General as the Director for Political Affairs in his executive office. I think it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the ODI.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah has asked me to talk about flawed peace agreements in fragile states. So I need to, first of all, thank you for bringing me to London so that I could escape New York, where I was dealing with a flawed peace agreement in a fragile state, which was Afghanistan. What I want to do is perhaps practically look at peace agreements and how we can make the most of peace agreements in order to provide the most solid foundation for countries in a post-conflict recovery. I think what I want to touch on are probably generally true for peace agreements, but in fragile states, the flawed nature of peace agreements are multiplied and the effects are catastrophic. The first issue I want to raise is the importance for peace agreements to deal with their own implementation. There's often an assumption that peace agreements are self-implementing. And in fact, really until the 1990s, most peace agreements didn't consider and deal with the necessity of spelling out how they will be implemented. And how they will be implemented needs to touch on who, when, and where each of a wide variety of commitments are going to be implemented. In general, what happens at the end of a substantive negotiation of a peace agreement, there's a rush to signature. And it's a rush not only driven by the parties, but by the international community. In particular, I can remember in Sudan, where there was pressure from the USA for domestic electoral purposes to be able to hold out the comprehensive peace agreement as a foreign policy success. And were irritated by the advisors, who happened to be me and a colleague, who were pointing out that current figures showed that 70% of all peace agreements broke down in the implementation phase, and that we needed to properly specify in a separate protocol exactly who was going to do what and with what money, only to sort of meet great resistance, not only from the players, but from the international community. What are some of those issues which require specific attention? Well, I think firstly it's very important that peace agreements don't contain commitments which the parties can't meet. And I think while that's a general truism, I want to look at three particular areas. Firstly, the means, affordability. We used to say in South Africa, for every constitutional lawyer, one needs a cost accountant, handcuffed probably best. And that's because when you're dealing with and grappling with how to bring parties together, the imagination and mind of a lawyer will reach to any range of institutions, and no one will consider how those institutions will be paid for. Particularly when you're dealing with, as peace agreements now increasingly do, lower levels of government, subnational government, local government. There's a failure to work out who's going to pay for those new structures, and sometimes who's going to man those new structures. Many in fragile states, particularly, the tasks of, or should I say, the lure of central government tends to suck up all the oxygen, and certainly all the most talented staff, leaving critical institutions unmanned leaving local government, which very often has very explicit obligations and services to deliver, simply unable to function. And if that's true for personnel, I think it's also true for the institutions. Certainly one of my sort of learning points was moving from the South African experience and having been a negotiator there, essentially drafting a constitution, which was our peace agreement, founded on the notion of equality, underwritten by robust legal institutions, and trying to put forward a similar solution for Burundi, and being met with, quite frankly, disbelief and skepticism, because in Burundi the legal institutions could never interdict the army from committing a genocidal attack on its own population. The legal institutions could hardly perform the function of guaranteeing any fundamental rights. And I think that's so in peace agreements generally there has to be a realistic assessment of what the institutions in that society can manage. I think it's very important that peace agreements provide for the empowerment of women in the reconstruction process and in the post-conflict recovery. And the best way that, and I do that not out, and it's not a kind of politically correct phenomenon, it's a factual observation that women have a particular interest in the success and sustainability of peace agreements. And yet not only do the peace agreements not address them, but it's a very rare peace process that allows women at the table. And so perhaps the best way to ensure that peace agreements do address the role of women is to have them at the table, which I can tell you is a lot easier said than done. And at least 2 or 3 of the peace processes I've been in, the negotiators and facilitators have attempted to insist on gender representation or gender quotas in party delegations, but to be met only with outrage on the part of party leaders at the suggestion that outsiders could dictate who should represent their political tendency. I think the financial viability of the state generally needs to be tackled in considerable detail. We've seen in the Congo, for example, a set of promises around the distribution of finance, a distribution of revenue to other levels of government which are not upheld. We see the same as we speak in the Sudan and elsewhere. I think that we need to consider in a far more robust way financial viability of fragile states. Let me talk briefly about creative and sometimes fatal ambiguity. Ambiguity is a tool in the toolbox of the mediator. There's a necessity to find agreement, and ambiguity is very often the way in which you allow both parties to come away with an expression with a different understanding of what that expression means, and even an understanding that the other side has a different understanding. And that's okay if it's dealing with the role of relationship between religion and the state. But when it deals with, for example, the details of a ceasefire, it can have tragic consequences, as it did in Zimbabwe and Namibia. Some issues cannot be party to the creative ambiguity principle, and particularly those which start to deal with when soldiers report for cantonment and where they report and what stage they lay down their weapons. Perhaps one of the most divisive issues in peace agreements is in devising mechanisms to deal with divisive issues. Unless a peace agreement foresees that a time will come when the parties will differ and that the deep issues and the underlying issues will surface and they have a mechanism to deal with them, they will run into deadlocks. And if there's no deadlock breaking mechanism, there's no implementation, there are no guarantors, and if there is no way of establishing a mechanism, you will end up, as Morgan Tsvangirai now finds himself, unable to drive past the deadlock. I think peace agreements have to provide 2 elements to them. Well, let me put it this way. I've categorized limping peace agreements as peace agreements which provide for a political process but do not provide an end to the violence. And certainly in Sudan at one stage it was the view of the SPLM that their negotiating power at the table would be based on their strength in the battlefield, and they felt that negotiations should take place simultaneously with the armed struggle. But after one particular military incident, the overrunning of a garrison in Tirit, it became clear that the negotiations were being held hostage to battlefield fortunes. And I can speak also in South Africa when, in a sense, in a test of the power of the street and brinkmanship, the very kind of the very peace process itself found itself on the brink of a precipice until both parties realized that they had to pull back from confrontational politics in order to engage in the peace process. But the opposite is also true. If you have a ceasefire without a political process, the ceasefire will eventually wither away, and that is in effect what happened in Sri Lanka. The provision of a ceasefire, which lasted, quite frankly, for a number of years, longer than it probably should have, in the absence of any political process at all, but was destined to flounder as a limping peace agreement. Another contentious issue is how voluntary should the agreement be? How willing should the parties be to sign the peace agreement? The conventional wisdom is that no agreement is sustainable unless the parties are willing to sign on and to implement it. Obviously, if their arms are twisted, questions can be raised around whether they're committed to seeing it through. In a sense, that was true for Burundi, and I know that Nelson Mandela was criticized for twisting arms to an unbearable degree in order to secure that peace agreement. In my view, I'm not a purist on this, and in all peace agreements, to some extent or another, are the result of the pressure which the international community places on unwilling parties. But a degree of stakeholding in the agreement is necessary. And the slogan, the rhetorical, obvious answer is to build a process which is inclusive. And I think that's right. I think processes which are inclusive are more likely to be sustainable. But in practice, it's a little bit more difficult than that. In a conflict setting, there are usually two belligerent parties, and no peace agreement or no ceasefire is possible unless the peace agreement starts with the belligerent parties. And that was certainly true in the Sudan. And those parties can, as they did in South Africa, insist on broadening the process to a much more inclusive and extensive range of players, or, as in Sudan, insist that it be confined to the two major combatants. All agreements, as I say, will start off with two. The remedy, in my view, is to either extend it, as they did in South Africa, or what we attempted to do in Sudan is to provide for processes further down the line in which you can remedy the lack of inclusivity by allowing other parties to participate in open discussions on those issues which have national application. In a perfect world, bilateral peace talks would focus on the modalities of laying down your weapon, and then a fuller, more inclusive constitutional forum would look at an eventual settlement. Well, it doesn't always play out like that. Certainly in Sudan, the parties were very resistant and in fact argued that broadening it out would make it difficult. And in fact, allowing it to broaden out as a simple proposition raises its own problems and difficulties for mediators, but for the parties themselves. Most centrally, how do you take decisions? In South Africa, that issue came to be perhaps the sharpest point of difference, because there are two principles at stake. The one is that a peace agreement, and in my view a constitution, which is a peace agreement of a kind, a social contract, needs depth of support. It needs a majority an extensive majority of citizens in South Africa, black South Africans, to participate and endorse that contract. But constitutions also apply, or national social contracts, to everybody who lives in the society, so you need breadth as well. But if you have breadth, on what basis are you going to take decisions? Simple majority, in which case the minorities have no guarantee that their concerns will be addressed. And trying to reconcile those two tensions, and they do oppose each other, is the test and is the trick. In South Africa, it was done in a particular way by allowing a first-level process decided on through breadth, all participants agreeing, each with a veto, followed by an election which would allow weight to count and representation, weight of representation to go to the party with the greatest support. But also as someone who participated in the Burundian process, where there were 24 parties with no proven support, it allowed bit players, some parties allegedly had 2 members, the founder and his wife, to exercise a veto, to have unparalleled support, which he would never have in any other process except through one which took the breadth argument centrally. So inclusivity is a difficult issue. The final issue I wanted to look at is democracy. My time has largely run out, but I wanted to, let me just at least put the question to you that we all face. In fragile states, peace agreements would, and typically do, provide for a competitive electoral contest. Paul Collier, who has studied and compiled information and statistics based on the experience of post-conflict societies, has shown that competitive multi-party electoral contests are most likely to provoke a slide back into conflict. In a sense, a conclusion I'd come to myself when asked to address a set of independent electoral commissions on what rules they should enact to prevent violence in elections. And I came to the conclusion, rather reluctantly, that elections were dangerous moments in fragile states' history. In a post-conflict setting, the fault lines are exaggerated, the underlying conflicts come to the surface. Certainly in Southern Africa, in many states, we hold our breath every time there's a new election. And so it raises essentially the question, what approach do we take? Now, my view is that what is productive of the violence is not the rules, but the prize. And the prize is the problem, because in particularly developing societies, and arbitrary boundaries, heterogeneous, not homogeneous, with multi-party democracy imposed on already deep existing ethnic, linguistic, and religious fault lines, the political contest becomes group politics, in which group belonging determines political behavior, not interest-based politics. And the very objective of electoral politics then becomes to capture the state through a captive ethnic constituency, leading to permanent minorities and permanent majorities. And all politics from then on are hinged around the ethnic principle, because they continue to serve as the basis for the holding and plunder sometimes of the state. Okay, one minute. My answer to Paul Collier is not to do away with the electoral contest, but to find electoral contests, to redefine the prize in ways in which the electoral contest is integrating rather than disaggregating. And there are a number of ways, and we see in Africa, which bears the brunt of many of this divisive politics. We see many forms in which electoral contests become more and more integrating. In Nigeria, where there has to be evidence of multi-ethnic support before you can be a successful candidate. In governments of national unity, which provide for access to executive positions, although you're in the opposition. in requirements of representativity, through a renewed interest in autonomy, which allows, as Kieran was pointing out, people who are losers in the primary contest to be winners in a secondary contest. And in all of those ways, to have some kind of stakeholding in the state. So the answer I'm trying to give to Paul Collier is to go beyond the quantitative analysis and to find ways in which we can have an electoral politics which is integrating, and I think important for all the other reasons, because it emphasizes accountability, it provides for real political competition in the circulation of ideas, and it should allow a migration away from ethnic categories towards an interest-based politics, which I think is possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.